So in this talk, I'm going to try to tie together a few different conversations and questions that have come up over the last couple of days, and one good YouTube comment by someone who keeps me honest on Buddhist terminology and so forth. So it can be valuable to explore the nature of interpretation. And one way of starting is just to ask yourself, how do I interpret life? What is interpretation? How do I use it? How often am I aware I'm interpreting versus simply experiencing? And what is the cost of interpretation? Also, what drives the interpretive filters? And am I aware of that at all? Am I aware of what it is that causes me to interpret things a certain way? Or interpret various things, people, and situations at different times? Sometimes I use the term overlay, and the medium of interpretation is thought. Of course, there's nothing fundamentally wrong with thought or with a thought. But where it leads to suffering is where first we identify with it, then we become unaware of its distorting nature, or we become unaware of the fact that we are using thought as a lens of interpretation and then not knowing it or forgetting about it again and again and again. The good news about all this business is you can become aware of this very, very easily, and all of us have become aware of it numerous times, with a willingness to become aware. One way of doing that is just to ask yourself, what thought am I entertaining at the moment? Or what is the next thought? Another way of entertaining this question is to ask yourself, what belief is operating in the background right now? Or what belief is shaping my experience? Those last two questions are very valuable when you find yourself in a place that feels stuck with practice or with life. Feels like you're a hamster in a wheel, or during retreat, let's say, when things just start to feel sort of muddy or solid, and you don't know why or how, but you do feel like something is holding or feels sticky about the process, and you suspect it's a mental process, or at least partially a mental process. In those moments, in those cases, it can be really helpful just to ask yourself, just broaden your sort of scope of consideration, broaden your scope of focus into a sort of dilated conscious experience, and just ask yourself, what belief is operating in the background? Often the belief will be something along the lines of, I feel stuck, or I feel uncomfortable, and I don't want to. Or just, I feel stuck. If you look at that closely, you'll see that the assumption is already that I don't want to feel stuck, or I feel tight or contracted, or an emotion state. I feel grief, intense grief. I feel anger. I feel fear, and I don't want to. The reason I add on the I don't want to part is that the very fact that it's prominent in consciousness, or it's shaping in consciousness, means that there's some polarity set up already. There's some resistance patterns set up, and resistance patterns can't be set up with one pole. There's always something that's pushing on it. So if there's an interpretation that I'm feeling physical pain, or I'm feeling intense grief, or I feel stuck, there's something pushing on that. That's the interpretation of what's happening, and simultaneously there's a sense of an interpreter, and a sense of somebody for whom that is true. And that's the polarity that gets set up. So again, if you ask the question, what belief is shaping my experience right now, or what belief is operating in the background? It doesn't even have to be in the background. I just say that because it opens you to a sort of more expanded space of discovery. Just be open to seeing that whatever the interpretation is of what's happening, whatever the sticking point is, there's going to be an attached judgment to that, and it's going to be essentially, I don't want that. Adyashanti has a nice thing he talks about where he says that at the core of all of the layers of identity and so forth, there's just something that's just saying no all the time. It's like no, 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 no. No to what I'm feeling, no to letting it go, no to just everything, right? No to my body, no to my own mortality, no to illness, no to pain, no to the unknown, no to waking up, like just says no. I think that's a really potent way of looking at it or looking into it. But the mechanics of it are resistance. So that's one simple way of getting at what your interpretation is of the moment, even when it's not obvious, when you just feel its shadow, so to speak. There are more specific ways as well that are situational to look into interpretation, what your interpretation is and how it's affecting your experience in the moment. When it comes to people, situations with people, relationships, work situations, often it can be helpful to ask, well, you start from where you are. You may not even know what's bothering you, but you can ask, what is it about this person or the situation that bothers me? And that's usually not too hard to figure out. Although you may have more than one answer to the question. You may have a litany of concerns or problems with that person, situation, experience, event. Now, although this is, I believe, very much centered around people and interpersonal dynamics, be willing to see that often that gets externalized to bodies of people or groups or the government or the conspiracy, the people perpetuating the conspiracy on you out there. And when it becomes almost pathological or does become pathological, it turns into a sort of paranoia. But if you really just ask, you'll find, well, what is it I don't like about that? What is it I don't like about this? Or I think that's a good place to start. And once you're clear on what it is you don't like, what that person did or said, or what they didn't do or said, or what the situation, the environment, could be your work, your career, your pastime that you're involved in a group of people, and it's not going the way you want it to, and so forth. The opposite question, but probably just as important, if not more important, is what do I think that should be providing me? So if I don't like that person is ignoring me, what's the converse of that? I want that person to give me attention. This is often harder to see. I can't tell you exactly why it's harder to see, but I have suspicions as far as human nature. I think we tend to be, many people tend to be sort of people pleasers. Sensitive people tend to take on the pain and the emotion states of others and repressed emotions and so forth. And so we sort of put others before us in a way as far as comfort and so forth. So we forget that we're actually underneath all of that people pleasing and so forth. We actually want something, but we can't see that about ourselves because we may even develop an identity and pride ourselves on being the one who never needs anything or always being the helper and so forth. So asking yourself, okay, well, if I don't like that behavior from that person, what do I really think they should be doing? What's the underlying or the logical conclusion of that? And it's often built right into what you don't like about them. You can see it, right? If I think that person should be supporting me more, or I'm sorry, if I feel like that person's doing something that's unsupportive, if I look at it, I probably feel like they should be supporting me. At least then you can look at it in a more logical way. Well, is that a fair thing to look for? Is that something they can even provide, right? Do they have the capacity for that? For instance, it could be my partner doesn't love me, right? That's what I don't like about that. They don't love me. They don't treat me well or something. But if you look at the converse of it, this person should love me. They should love me unconditionally, or they should notice me, or whatever it is you're seeking. When you see it in the positive, as stated as a positive, then you can actually assess more clearly. Does this person have that capacity? Maybe they can't. Maybe they can't love themselves. So they can't love you. You just start seeing it more clearly. Or sometimes it's totally unreasonable, right? But until you see what you actually want, what you're actually seeking from a person, a situation, an event, group, etc., you may not be clear on the fact that you actually want something that's either impossible for them to deliver, unreasonable for them to deliver, or perhaps it's possible, but it would be unhealthy. It would be an unhealthy arrangement or relationship. Yeah. So looking into things in that way can be helpful because we see what we actually want. We see what we're really seeking. And then we have access to the interpretation of that person, the overlay. We start to see where we're actually not seeing the person. We're seeing a patchwork of interpretations and expectations, and we're replacing the person with that. So we think we're seeing a person out there, but we're seeing a bunch of conditioned responses, expectations, and interpretations that we dreamed up with the help of our parents and other people we've come in contact with and all of humanity. That starts to bring in a different dimension of compassion when you realize, oh my gosh, when I expect something from someone, I've already erased them out of reality in a sense. I'm totally disconnected with them. I can't see that. You won't see somebody if you have a lot of expectations for what they should do or shouldn't do, etc. You just totally overlook them. And they feel it, actually, by the way. And you may be in a situation or relationship with somebody who expects to be not seen. And so it may work in a certain way. But just be aware that until you see clearly what your own filtering is, what your own interpretation system is, and how it's affecting the way you see the external world, other people, relationships, family members, friends, coworkers, and then again, extrapolated to groups of people, you'll think that's the world you're looking at. You'll think the world is that way, but it's not that way, not necessarily that way. So that's a way of getting at interpretation or your own interpretive mechanism and tendency when it comes to people, situations, relationships, etc. There's an interesting way through this that's not necessarily insight-based. It's more action-based. and that is unconditional love. If you just make a commitment to actually seeing every person you come in contact with, seeing them completely on their own side, not through the lens of you or what you think you need them to be or what you think you need from them, you'll experience people very differently. It's maybe more challenging for a group in a way because group dynamics are more complex, but you'll start to have a more perhaps less judgmental, more reasonable and healthy understanding of how groups function and how organizations function and so forth, because you realize they are made of people. And all these people are interpreting with their own filters, and then they start to act a certain way based on whatever group they're in and so forth. But on an individual basis, it's not a complicated practice. What it takes is vulnerability and getting out of your own way. It takes getting out of your own head, the safe place of self-consciousness that can actually ruin communications, unfortunately. Even though you don't interpret yourself or feel like you are doing something selfish in the act of being self-conscious, holding back, hesitating in an interaction, not connecting or communicating at a deep level, it is essentially a self-oriented approach. Rather, just see what's right in front of your face. See the person that's right in front of your face and who they are, how they move. See their humanness, what all humans want, and that they deserve to be seen, to be loved, to be heard. Your attention is the most powerful thing you can give any person, object, experience in the universe. But when your attention is not distorted by self-centered thoughts, beliefs, concerns, hesitations, then it's one and the same with unconditional love, which is very powerful and transformative, if that's the only practice. And I think it's uncommon probably for people, but for some people it is their practice. That is the way they move through the world, and it works really well. But you have to take that through as well, and that will at some point start dissolving your identity structures. And when you feel that, it can be scary. But if you trust unconditional love, perhaps this is the path of devotion, but not devotion to a deity or a guru necessarily, a devotion to what's right in front of your face, to the capacity you have for love. I think at some point in realization, this becomes more clear, I think, to anyone. But again, some people really resonate with this and can move this way through the world if they give themselves permission to. And when you bump into someone like that, you know it. It's an extraordinary person who can move that way. So you could say liberation is liberation from ignorance in the Buddhist use of the word ignorance, or not knowing. And in the previous talk, I kind of sloppily just said that's what that means, is not seeing the way things actually are, not knowing how things actually are, which could be misinterpreted as a belief that there is a certain way things are and you have to figure it out or know it. And that's not at all what that means, and not what I meant by it. What it means is that in any given situation, seeing what's not there and being clear on that, and not trying to add what isn't there. So, solidity. Are there actually objects? Is there an other at all? Is there even a possibility for there to be an other or a self as opposed to another? So, is there anything actually there in the actual? This is to break this illusion would be called non-duality properly. To fully realize not to. Fully realize there is no ability for there to be separation, distance, objects, discreteness, substance, perception. It's just not there. And to not need to interpret reality such that it appears to be there, to see that that's not needed, is freedom. Also, the act or the tendency to feel in control, to feel like you are controlling or that control is possible, in a not necessarily in a gross way, but in a very subtle way. What's required for that is the sense that there's perpetuity, that there's permanence, that there's something out there that I can count on to predict, know, and understand in a way that makes me feel like I have control. And to see that that's just not happening. It's never been happening. And that's the term impermanence in Buddhism. And we all know it, which is really interesting. We know it, we believe it and understand it for the most part, but we still process information and attach to that information processing in a way and build an identity around it that assumes that it is true. Assumes that this body isn't going to dissolve and turn to dust, and all those other bodies are going to dissolve and turn to dust. And that everything you've accumulated, all the knowledge, understanding, all the realizations, friends, family members, is just dust. Not just going to turn to dust, it sort of already is. Because what fat lot of good it does you now to hold on to that or cling to that when you see it's already going away. And yet that clinging is a sort of innate belief, or maybe not innate, a sort of passive belief in permanence or predictability or perpetuity. And so ignorance is to ignore that simple truth that we actually already know. And that leads to suffering. Ignoring that just leads to suffering because it's not true. It's not the way it is. And the tendency to believe that we can somehow arrange our experience so that we only feel pleasurable experiences or pleasant experiences and can always avoid unpleasant experiences, even though we have constant evidence to the contrary. We still believe that that's possible. That's the sense of volition, doership, agency, that arises from, that sense arises from the fundamental belief that's structured in our processing, in our interpretive apparatus, that we can somehow avoid discomfort. It's not possible. As long as we're, as my Zen teacher used to say, as long as we're in this body-mind, as long as we're alive in this physical form, you're in the soup. That's what he would say. You can't get out of the soup. You're in the soup. So essentially, ignorance is not recognizing that there is no way to completely avoid unpleasant experiences, situations, sensations, emotions. But but to see through that ignorance is to see that it's okay, that you can't avoid that it's lawful. It's just how it is. There's no need to. There's no need to construct a self. There's no need to construct duality. There's no need to construct the illusion of agency to avoid that. To avoid unpleasantness, or to avoid seeing that you can't avoid unpleasantness and you can't always feel pleasant experiences, sensations, and so forth. What a misinterpretation about experiences being pleasant, unpleasant, neutral, and suffering, dukkha, unsatisfactoriness, is that they are one and the same, or they feel the same. It's similar to reactivity in that we just feel as if we have to react to certain things, situations, events, people. When the reaction's occurring, it feels like the reaction is almost seamless with what we're reacting to, like it has to be that way, because it's buried in our interpretation. This is similar, but at a deeper level, that the fact that there is that there are pleasant experiences possible. Physical pain is a simple example. The fact that that's possible would seem like it would have to lead to a kind of suffering, but it doesn't. The suffering is the, I don't want to say fault, but the suffering is inherent in the interpretation that we can do something about it. So we think we can't be okay with impermanence until it's realized, until it's very clear what that is, that it's just that way, it's always been that way, it can only be that way, which is no particular way, but there's nothing that's permanent you can count on. To experience it directly is rather enjoyable. But when an interpretation gets in between, and there's not really anything that's getting in between, but what feels like it's getting in between is you and the experience, you and the direct experience, you and the event or the situation. Then it appears as if that's a very uncomfortable or unacceptable or not okay situation or experience. So it's, again, valuable to explore interpretation. You can you can ask at any time, any moment, as you're moving through the day, how is interpretation operating now? That may give you concrete answers. Oh, I'm interpreting such and such in this way, and that's been making me feel like I need to change it. But what if my interpretation's incorrect? That may let me off the hook. I don't feel like I have to struggle with that anymore or change it or do something about it. Or it may just be even a deeper level of experience where you ask yourself, what am I interpreting now? Or what is being interpreted? Or what is the act of interpretation resulting in experientially right now? And then just look into your experience and see. You may notice it stops. There's nothing that says interpretation has to be going on. There's nothing that says interpretation has to be operating. And it's at the level of thought. It's a cognitive thing. It can be non-conceptual and subtle. It can be a filtering, a perceptual filtering, but it's thought-based ultimately. So without having relationship in thought or relationship to thought, which means not pushing and pulling on thought, not struggling against thought, not going to war with thoughts, not being suspicious of thoughts, just seeing a thought for what it is. Is there even interpretation going on at all at that point? Do we need interpretation? Now, maybe in a practical sense, at times you may need interpretation in life, externally and so forth. But do we actually need to internally interpret our experience? Do we need to use our mental faculties to alter experience in any way whatsoever, to reflect upon it? Do we even need to interpret it as an experience in opposition to an experiencer? Or can that just stop? Hold this lightly, but the experience of interpretation stopping feels something like there's nothing to do. But it's the kind of nothing to do that feels really compelling and present. And peaceful. You see that everything takes care of itself internally and externally. Everything's right on time. Every thought is right on time. Every sensation is right on time. Every emotion is right on time. You could say things become clearly synchronistic, although there aren't really things. There's no world in which that's happening. But the singular experience of a sound, or the body sense, or one breath, is all that's needed. There's no interpretation required. And in one sense, there's no interpretation possible, because you could say our mind makes interpretation appear as if you're altering something, changing something into something more useful, but you're not changing anything. Thought doesn't change anything, doesn't alter anything. So perhaps I could say it this way, that all relationship to thought, belief in thought as anything beyond thought, or that it has volition, or that it's a problem, it goes away. And what's interesting is with some people, I'd be curious to talk to them about it, but some people will claim that their thoughts go away as well. the mind gets very quiet. Someone asked me, messaged me the other day and asked, and this is someone who has deep insight, do I equate the mind going quiet and having no internal dialogue with realization or liberation? And I definitely don't. I can give you two good reasons. One is there's a lot of counterexamples of people who say they have quiet mind and they hate it. They think that's causing all their suffering, sure of it. On the other hand, there are certainly liberated people who have thoughts. So when someone says that their thoughts go away or almost entirely away, I don't doubt that their mind got a lot quieter, because I think that does happen for sure. And sometimes it happens like in an instant. And perhaps sometimes it happens more gradually. But when I talk about thought, I'm talking about quite a spectrum of phenomena, let's say. From very gross thoughts. First of all, being identified with thought, you can be so identified with thought you don't know you're having thoughts, for sure. Again, that quote I think I said the other day by Sam Harris that, I'm probably screwing up his quote, someone just posted on somewhere, but I thought it was good. Ego is what it feels like to be thinking without knowing you're thinking. And I have had people message me when I talk about aphantasia who say I don't have an internal dialogue, I don't have internal thoughts and so forth. And when I talk to them for about 5 minutes, they start to realize they actually do. They're just identified with them. They don't realize, they think they are the thought. They think the thought that they're having feels like them. That's my identification. So yeah, the presence and absence of thoughts, don't worry about that. What matters is your relationship with thought. Do you believe, first of all, do you even know you have thoughts? Then starting to realize, oh my gosh, how much they're shaping my reality and how much I'm pushing and pulling on thoughts. And then at a deeper level, you start to realize that you still subtly push and pull on thoughts, resist thoughts, hold yourself in resistance to certain thoughts and beliefs. Then you start to delve into what belief really is and how much it actually shapes your experience, which I could call a thought, but I would call a little bit more of a thought that's been solidified into a view, formed into a view. And if it's formed into a view, you're looking from the view. It's like the lens of the camera looking outward doesn't see the mechanisms behind the electronics, the mechanical parts and so forth. That's the belief. But you can get back to it. And by asking these types of questions I mentioned, that's how you do it, through inquiry. What belief is shaping my experience? And then at some point, the mind does get quiet, the body-mind gets quiet. And when we're not in reactivity all the time, or maybe not at all, we are freed up with we have so much bandwidth. We're freed up we have so much presence in comparison to how it was when the mind was much louder, that it's just easier to see subtle things. And then we really start to see this subtle identifying mechanism in thought, as I was talking about in one of the recent talks, where you can start, I think it might have been a guided meditation, I can't remember, but you start to see the moments of grasping onto a thought, a belief, a perceptual filter. And what the very fundamental perceptual filters do is make two assumptions. One is that there's something out there to take a picture of, that there's something, some way that things are, some paradigm to grasp and say, oh, that's how it is now. Because if I know how it is now, I can control how it's going to be later, is the underlying assumption. So that snapshotting that the mind does, that you start to sense actually watching that happen and feeling that happen, and you recognize the signature of grasping, of mental grasping, and then that can subside. Then a thought is just a thought. And often you become even more interested then in what the heck a thought even could be, and explore it in very direct ways, in and as consciousness, but with a sort of innocent curiosity, because you don't feel like your life hinges upon any thought or interpretation. Identity has disentangled itself from thought and interpretation at this point. So you can still see subtle influences by thought at times, but they're subtle and they dissolve quickly. So at that point, even the subtle attachment to thoughts, beliefs, etc., can dissolve. And then typically the thoughts just calm down more and more because they don't really, you realize, I think most people probably would realize that what keeps thoughts stirring, what keeps the mind active, what actually creates what feels like a solid thought and then externally a solid world that we think is the world, but it's basically a collection of thoughts and perceptions. What was actually keeping that going was a sort of will. It was a sort of assumed volition inside of thoughts. We were pushing and pulling on the thoughts. And when that stops happening, then the impetus for a thought to form is not so much there. So they can still form, but they don't have, there's just not much to them. So, so I think, especially early on, the best position to take in regard to thoughts overall is just to remind yourself they're not a problem. Don't wrestle with them. Don't struggle with them. Don't push them away. If you're feeling struggle inside of the conscious space or in consciousness and thought, if you're feeling pushing and pulling, you're probably, I wouldn't say you're doing something wrong. You're just adding unnecessary effort, and it's not really helpful usually. It just keeps stirring the pot. The way to rest in that pure conscious experience or pure consciousness or unbound consciousness is to take a very, very neutral stance to all thought. But I had a guided meditation recently that had sort of addressed that. But yeah, just as a overarching, I guess, thought experiment, what would it be to have no need to interpret? If things could just be what they are, very simply. Every experience is just very simply what it is. Nothing added at all. We're not having reactions to it. We're not taking a position in regard to it. We're not apart. There's nothing apart from it. And it's not something. It's not something discrete and solid out there somewhere. Is that possible to live that way? And how that is possible is moment to moment, really. Trusting the appearances. To be just what they are. Without adding interpretation and reactivity. And expectation. Okay, we can end early.